Welcome everybody here in the room. It's so great to see you and everybody who's watching from home. This is Local History Happy Hour, the Museum of Ventura County's program where we interview local authors about themselves, their books, their region, etc. And tonight, as Eric said, we are going to be interviewing Dr. Frank Barajas. Frank, can I call you Frank?
Yes, please.
Okay, good. I might call you Doc sometimes. Frank is an author who has just written his second, or published his second book, which is called Mexican Americans with Moxie. It's a long title, I have to look at it. A transgenerational history of El Movimiento Chicano in Ventura County, 1945 to 1975. Frank is not only an author, he is also an historian, and he is the chair of the history department at Cal State Channel Islands. Before I start talking with Frank, I just want to say, you in the audience, we're going to talk for about 40-45 minutes, and then we're going to break for questions. So we'll take them from the live audience first, so please be thinking about things, and we'll go out. And you at home, please put your questions in the Q&A section if you're on Zoom, or in the comments if you're on Facebook, or write them with a skywriter if you're in a plane, whatever. Just send us your questions. We would love to take them before we end the evening at 6 o'clock. So it is Local History Happy Hour. And because it is, we always have a happy hour beverage, which is selected by our author. And Frank has chosen Budweiser. So Frank, tell us why you chose Budweiser this evening.
Well, because it's the king of beers. One reason why is I grew up in a working class family in Ventura County. And I remember going to my grandmother's house, or my grandfather's house in Moorpark, family gatherings, uncles, aunts, and so forth. And Budweiser was always the beer. It was not Modelo or Corona, or it was Budweiser, and that's what I grew up with. It's not my favorite beer, but you know, that's part of being Chicano, right? Is you have these influences from different cultures, you know, German-based beer, I imagine, right? And it was the favorite of my uncles and my dad, and particularly my grandfather. Up until he passed away, I always remember him. He had a Budweiser in his hand, and his circulation was not so, but he had a little towel around it so he could still have his beer. So that's why I chose Budweiser, in memory of my grandfather, and also, you know, that's what I grew up with in terms of a beverage.
Well, great. Well, cheers to your family.
Salud.
To history. To all of us here this evening. And at home. Okay, so the book, again, is Mexican Americans with Moxie, a transgenerational history of El Movimiento Chicano in Ventura County, 1945 to 1975. So it's quite a mouthful, especially the subtitle there. And I always read the books, obviously, for Local History Happy Hour, and I was a bit intimidated with that sort of intro to it, because I'm not a history student, I'm not a professor, I'm not a graduate student, I'm not anything. And so I was prepared to be have a lot of words that I didn't understand, and have a lot of very, very esoteric theories. And it's a very thoughtful book, and it's a great book. It's a great read. And one of the things I just love about it is it's about these really big movements and issues that are not just Ventura County based, they're national. And it's all told, most of it is told through stories about individual people. And we all know people, and we all like people. So I think it's a really important book. Thank you for us. And there's something very special about it because we know some of the names in there. All right, so let's start. I first of all want to talk about the title of your book, Mexican Americans with Moxie. How did you come up with that? And second part to this question, El Movimiento Chicano. Tell us, those of us who don't know about the Chicano movement necessarily, can you just educate us about that a bit?
Sure. First, the title emerged from an interview I did early on. When I finished Curious Unions, the first book I wrote, I knew that there was a much larger story than just Oxnard ending in I think it was 1961. So I started interviewing people of the Chicano movement and the Chicana movement. And right before I interviewed somebody, another author at Cal State Northridge talked about the Chicano movement in Los Angeles and Cal State Northridge students. One of the students was, and he had described his students as being really bold, right? And so I interviewed her. Her name is Diana Borrego Martinez. She's mentioned in the book in terms of her activism and arrest for anti-war protest. And so I asked Diana, right? I said, Professor Rodolfo Acuna, who was at Cal State University Northridge, emeritus professor, characterized you as, you know, being really bold and assertive and brave, right? And she paused and she said, well, we had Moxie. Right. And I love that word because I also grew up in the 1990s with Dick Vitale, who's a basketball announcer, right? And he uses these big words. I'm a logophile. And he was describing the UCLA freshman players, right? And he said, "You got Moxie, baby." So I always love that word Moxie. And it kind of rhymes with Mexican Americans, right? Mexican. And that's where El Movimiento Chicano comes in too, because that generation of students in the mid to late 1960s and early 70s are usually identified and labeled as the Chicano generation or the Chicana generation, different from that of the Mexican American generation. And that's the way historians, you know, identify periods of time and eras, right? Usually generationally, but also framed by events of the time period. So, El movimiento, the movement, emerges from the elan, the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age of the anti-war movement of the 1960s, the anti-colonial movements that were taking place in Africa and Latin America and Asia, and also the counterculture movement, the student movements, the Students for Democratic Society that was taking place. So this was one movement among many movements, right? But this one had to do with ethnic Mexicans, right? And I say ethnic Mexicans because the Mexican community is diverse. You have people of ethnic Mexican background that were here in the United States before it was the United States. They were here when California, Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada, you know, much of the Southwest was Mexico. This is conquered territory. You know, by warfare, the United States of America, that's why you have Nevada, California, Los Angeles, Santa Barbara. These are Spanish Mexican names, Ventura, Camarillo, right? These are Mexican American names. And these places were labeled before the US conquest by warfare, right? Then you have other Mexicans, ethnic Mexicans who came during the early 20th century, right? And they saw themselves as Mexican, right? So that's, and one historian calls this the Mexicanist identity. Because even though they were born, many Mexicans were born here, raised here, they lived in segregated areas. And where areas were predominantly Spanish speaking. And they had a Mexicanist identity, right? And later on in the 20th century, you had, after the Great Depression, there was the development of a Mexican American identity, particularly during World War II, right? And World War II created a sense of patriotism, nationalism, and they were now wanting to be ethnic Mexican Americans, right? And conform and achieve middle-class respectability. And by the 20 years later, after World War II, 1960s, many of the youth saw that their parents and their grandparents, no matter what they did, they weren't being accepted, right? Even though they were professionals and they were speaking English and without an accent, and you know, they were bilingual, they were buying homes, right? And they were becoming middle class, they were still not accepted. So the youth said, well, we're gonna define ourselves and we're gonna determine our own labels and call ourselves what we want. And the term, they labeled themselves, many of these students with a consciousness, and that's what the main part of what I try to say, they had a consciousness of their history, that they were not immigrants. I use the word a lot, migrants, right? They were migrating in the United States, in the Americas. This had always been their homeland. They weren't immigrants coming across the ocean. This is their homeland, which they would travel, to Mexico, travel to Texas. My grandmother was born and raised in McAllen, Texas, right? And so, but she married an immigrant from Michoacan, right? So students in the 1960s, they studied their history. And they said, no, we're not immigrants, no matter what, whether they come from Mexico or they're from here, we're not immigrants. We are native of this land, right? So they defined themselves, and they looked into indigenous cultures and indigenous labels, and from that, Chicano, right? And Chicana, and they labeled themselves that during that time period. And I have to say, I assumed that label myself, right? I usually, when I'm in a situation where it's a little contestation, I'll use that word to make a statement, right? Because they're dealing with a different character, right? Who knows his history, is empowered by his education. And so that's el movimiento, and that's the label Chicana Chicano.
Okay, so the book is, it covers this 30-year span, and it's somewhat chronological, but also it talks about sort of a number of big issues. A lot of it is about the relationship with the police community, specifically in Oxnard. You talk at length about the school district and segregation and integration at the schools, and about farm workers. And I'm realizing we had talked about, I would love for you to read an excerpt from your book, which has to do with one of the things I want to ask you about, which is the Brown Berets. Mm-hmm. So if you could do that.
The Brown Berets were one of these organizations of the 1960s. And the original group was from Los Angeles. So I could talk about how it developed here in Ventura County after I read this passage, which is a little bit lengthy, but not too lengthy. It's titled A Brown Beret Tutorial Program. The Brown Berets, however, did not limit its focus to the Oxnard Police Department's abuse of power. It also worked with the Oxnard Elementary School District to implement a culturally relevant tutorial program to reform an educational system whose duty was to educate all children equitably, but had failed to do so. Over time, approximately a dozen Brown Berets, women and men, participated in this project. In October 1968, Brown Beret member Robert Olivares contacted Norman Brecky, who was like an assistant superintendent back then. At the time, director of special projects at the Oxnard Elementary School District, to invite La Colonia teachers to the organization's tutorial workshop. During the meeting's orientation, Roberto Flores declared that the Brown Berets would administer the tutorial and proceeded to identify the challenges that faced ethnic Mexican students. This included the recognition that children of La Colonia required special attention because of their singular culture. La Colonia residents did not realize their academic potential. La Colonia students did not realize their academic potential due to the failure of teachers to meet their needs. Hence, Brown Beret tutors sought to address the deficiencies of teachers as educators, not the students' academic aptitude. Another objective of the tutorial program entailed the elevation of the amor propre of student children. Once students loved and felt confident about themselves, their academic achievement would zoom. Joe Barry, in charge of UCLA's high potential, high risk program and advisor to the campus organization United Mexican American Students, along with UCLA mathematician Professor David A. Sanchez, supported the tutorial program and attended the workshop. Barry situated the work of the Berets within the context of the movements of Reyes Lopez Tijerina in New Mexico, Cesar Chavez and Sal Castro's leadership in the student walkouts in East Los Angeles. To effectively educate and remedy the high dropout rate among ethnic Mexicans, Barry emphasized that educators must affirm their students' culture and value system. And I really believed from this study and that if all students were taught their culture, particularly in Ventura County, ethnic Mexicans were taught their history and culture, there would not be an achievement gap. Because once students know their history, know their language, know their place in society, they want to learn more. I mean, once I took a Chicano history class, I wanted to take other classes, right? I saw the interconnection from learning about the history of my grandparents, who were citrus workers, packing house workers in Ventura County. I wanted to stay in school, right? And I took Spanish classes because I wanted to communicate with my grandparents more effectively, because I am not fluent in Spanish to this day, right? I mean, today I interviewed somebody, and I, to be a good host, I went to go buy donuts. And I purposely went to go buy donuts because I didn't want to go to the panaderia, because I would have to speak Spanish. And they always kind of like, oh, they don't understand what I'm saying. I go, okay, let me say this differently. Let me point. But that's the sort of cultural conflict that goes on with Chicanos, right? They're not really Mexicans, and they're not really fully accepted as being, American, right? So they're Mexican Americans, the Chicanos, right? And, but going back to the tutorial program, these brown berets knew that the younger generation, the people that were just coming up behind them, that they learned their history. If their culture was affirmed, the sky was the limit in terms of their learning.
Okay, so the Brown Berets were around in the 60s, is that right? And that tutorial program that they were pitching to Mr. Brecky, did it happen?
It did happen. It was short-lived, right? Because people they transition and they go on to other places. They go to college and so forth. But they set an example. These were high school students, undergraduate students in college too. They were going to middle schools and they were devoting their time, right? And that's part of the Chicano movement, the 1960s. Anything was possible back then, right? And the 1960s, the revolution was real. Right? It was going to happen if we got together collectively and we worked together. We could build a better world. People believed that back then because they saw it in other countries. They saw, what was happening in Latin America. They saw the African countries gaining independence and self-determining themselves, right? And the people of the 60s, the students of the 60s, felt that if they worked together, they can make the world a better place.
So I know it's hard to look at events of recent past because we're in them, right? So you don't have the benefit of time to really sift through and look at the themes of everything that's happening. But we're in this time. You are a scholar in that period, in this movement period. What do you think when you see what's happening today in Ventura County, or what has happened over the last year? With the protests that erupted in June, et cetera. Do you see any similarities?
Well, yes, I do. I see, particularly not only in June, but what happened in January 6th. There's change taking place in our country. And many people are not comfortable with that change. Richard Hofstadter is a US historian, and he looked at the early 20th century, and he explained that the middle class Anglo-American back in the early 20th century was going through a status anxiety. They felt their status was being threatened by the corporates, sort of by the Carnegies, by the John D. Rockefellers, by the railroads, because they had so much power and might.
The robber barons.
The robber barons. There you go, the robber barons. Thank you. And they were frightened by. They were also frightened by Italian immigrants. They were frightened by Catholics, right? Jews coming into the country. They were frightened by different people entering the country, right? So they were shaken by that. And so during the progressive era, you had these immigration laws being created, keep out immigrants, the 1924 Reed-Johnson Act that eliminated Asian immigrants from coming to the United States of America. I mean, completely eliminated them. You can't come here if you're Asian, right? And also restricting other immigrant groups, particularly Southern Southern Europe, Italians, Greeks, for example, Eastern Europeans, Russian Jews, for example, restricted them from coming, a ban, if you will, a ban of immigrants. That was happening in the early 20th century. So that status anxiety is what we're seeing today. We're seeing that, and there's a resistance to this change that's inevitable. It's going to happen no matter what. It's just a matter of how it's going to happen, right? So, I guess what I want to say, Elena, is historians use this term a lot. History is about change and continuity, right? So the more we see change in society, the more we see the same taking place.
That's so great, because your book is so much about these not oxymorons, but these forces working against each other. And one of the things you try to do is try to thread through. We were talking about this earlier, and there's a lot of terrible things that happen in the world and happen in our community. And in writing about this, you're writing about people you're writing about people we know. And it's really interesting to read that and not see them painted as either a complete hero or complete villain, because there's nobody who's like a 100% lily white hero in this book.
Yes.
You don't pretend like that exists in life.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, I want to talk a little bit about the busing, because the Brown Berets happened before the busing, I don't know what you would call it, but the busing, the uproar over busing in Oxnard in 1971, 70, 71, 72. And there's a few chapters devoted to this, and we could literally talk about it all night. It is so fascinating. But I specifically want to talk about this one board meeting that happened. And I don't remember when the board meeting happened, but there was a board meeting where they were talking about busing, and a person in the audience, and I don't think you said who it was, I don't think you know who it was, shouted out that the school board had officially sanctioned segregation. So not just by ignoring it, but officially segregated students back in 1936 and 1938. So can you just tell us a little bit about that, how it impacted busing and what happened ultimately?
Yes. Well, Brown versus Board of Education was in 1954, right? And there was a lot of resistance nationwide to the integration of schools, right? And Oxnard was one of them. Areas in Pasadena, similarly, other communities in Berkeley were resisting the integration of schools. And in Oxnard was the same, right? And so two legal factors were taking place. There was the idea of de jure segregation, which is official of policy. And then there was de facto segregation that took place unofficially, right? And to a certain extent, part of the complication is segregation takes place because people feel comfortable who they're with, right? In a way, people self-segregate. And also at the same time, people are segregated, even though they want to be with other people or they want to live in certain neighborhoods, right? So this is happening at the same time. And in Oxnard, the Oxnard Elementary School District always said, this is de facto segregation. This is as a result of housing patterns. Neighborhood schools are developed because of housing patterns, hence the segregation and so forth and so on. And the event that you're describing is that, and it's always a mystery how this was found out. Some say that Norman Brecky, who was the administrator within the district, leaded attorneys to that. Some say the janitor found these minutes somehow, right? So there are these different stories, but in the Oxnard Press Courier, the report is that somebody at a meeting pointed to school board minutes in which it was officially detailed by the Oxnard Elementary School District Board that the segregation of students was going to take place to move ethnic Mexican students from white students on the demand of white parents, right? White parents did not want their children for many different reasons, mainly because they didn't want to have future son-in-laws or daughter-in-laws who were Mexican. That was basically it. They didn't want to have the intermixture of races. And it happens in school. Because you go to school together, you might like each other, right? You go on dates and you go on, have more than one date, and then you're married, right? And you're having children. And then there comes the issue of money, right? So we have to look at this, what's really involved too, right? And because parents are always concerned about the status of their children. And so are you going to marry a Mexican student who maybe comes from a poorer background than you, right? So there's this economic aspect of it all, right? So that's a new reading I'm doing, is the kind of looking at the material aspects of things and looking at the economics of forces. So what happens is that the school board minutes are found after the first trial. It was not really a trial, it was a judgment by Harry Pregerson, right? And the school board was still arguing this is de facto segregation. It's housing patterns, it's unofficial, people live where they want to live because that's just the way it is. It's natural almost, right? And where the Oxnard School Board District should have just accepted the initial ruling and complied, but they didn't. They fought it. And in the fight, the appeal of it, these school board minutes emerge. Leaves no question whatsoever that this was of policy by a white school board under pressure by white parents to segregate Mexican American school children. So, and from that, we had busing.
Yeah. So the appeal against busing was overturned.
That's right.
Yeah. Or whatever, was not listened to.
That's right. It was a done deal. Busing is going to proceed as it had been. Right.
Okay. So I know you grew up in Oxnard.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tell you're not like 30. Okay. And I think I'm just guessing that you're around the era when this was happening. So were you in school?
Yes. I am well away from 30. At that time period, 1971, I was born in 1964. That's okay. All right. 1964. So I was about, 7 years old. And 6 or 7 years old, and I was in the first grade. And I went to Driftwell Elementary, which I was telling you is named after one of the superintendents of the Oxnard Sugar Beet Company. And many of the schools were named after industrialists of that time period. They owned the city. Oxnard was a company town, yeah. Just like Santa Paula is a company town, or Limoneta, and so forth and so on, right? The industrialists of any industry, they ruled the city. So I went to Driftwell Elementary, and first, I went for kindergarten to Driftwell. Then I found myself being bused from my neighborhood on Hill Street and G Street to North Oxnard to Bertel, which is now no longer a school. They have housings there now, and it used to be part of a convent in Bertel. I was bused. And I always wondered, what's going on? Why am I waiting here now to go, less than 2 miles to this school? Because my neighborhood was integrated. My neighborhood was Asian American, African American, Mexican American, Filipino American. It was an integrated neighborhood, but the north side was not. The north side of Oxnard, after 5th Street, that was alien territory for people of color. You knew that was not your neighborhood if you were a person of color there. So they bused us to Bertel. And I was only bused for 1 year. That was another kind of the strange thing about bus for 1 year. And I went back to Bertel.
How long did the busing go on?
It went into the 80s, actually. Different parts of the town took a lot longer to integrate. But segregation still exists. My family and I, we go to Oxnard Shores, Silver Strand. That's a predominantly white part of Oxnard. Just like in Long Beach, if you go to Long Beach, you have pockets of places of Long Beach that are beach communities, largely Anglo-American, very few people of color. Then you go to other parts of Long Beach, that's the complete opposite, right? So these are part of the contradictions that exist, right, in our society, even to today.
When you talked about the name of your school, it reminded me of something. So you wrote a book before this called Curious Unions, which I have not read, which I will read. Again, I think everybody who lives in Ventura County should read this book. I will probably feel the same way about that one. But I think in that book, you talk about the strike of 1903, which has always interested me a lot. And it came up in our conversation with Jeff Mulhart about his history of Oxnard. I talked to him about that. And he talked about you as being the authority about that strike. So I don't want to say much more about it, but can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. I came across that event by reading a sociologist / historian, and I don't think he'll mind me saying his name. He's from Moorpark, emeritus professor Tomas Almaguer, who was at the Jorge Corralejo reception 2 weeks ago here, and he wrote an article on labor history in the 1980s on the 1903 sugar beet strike. And Kerry McWilliams, who's also another kind of doyen of California history, Kerry McWilliams is the first Chicano historian by many. I mean, he was a person from Colorado, Anglo-American male of the 1950s and 60s. Before that too, but wrote about Mexican Americans, called North from Mexico, a history of the Spanish-speaking people of the Southwest. Right. So if it's a great book. It's a classic. So he wrote a little bit about Oxnard. So I looked at that, and Tomas's article stops in 1903, and I said, wow, last thing I checked, ethnic Mexicans still live in Oxnard, right? Right. There has to be a continuing story, but it's an important strike because in that strike of sugar beet workers, this is unusual. This is what makes it really special. Ethnic Mexican labor contractors and sugar beet workers ally with Japanese American and Japanese immigrant labor contractors and sugar beet workers together in terms of protesting a 50% reduction in their wage rate. I mean, they weren't striking for higher wages or better working conditions. They were just striking to not, be cut. Imagine your wages being cut 50%, right? And why was that happening? Because the growers in Oxnard and also Ventura County, like business people, they want to maximize profits. That's the whole nature of our economic system, is maximizing profits. So if you can slash the wage rate by pitting workers against each other based on race and ethnicity and language, you win. But what happened here is that Japanese sugar beet workers, betabeleros, and ethnic Mexican sugar beet betabeleros, and their labor, that's even what makes it even more interesting. Labor contractors work together, right? And the labor contractors helped the workers to resist the 50% wage cut. And they won. They won. And the American Federation of Labor afterwards was going to unionize the Mexican workers, but they said, we won't unionize Japanese. And the ethnic Mexican worker says, well, we will not accept your affiliation unless you allow our brothers who fought with us and died with us, because there was violence. The police, sheriffs raided downtown Oxnard and broke up the strikers' organization. There was a gun battle, and some died. And so the ethnic Mexican workers refused the AFL affiliation unless it would include their brethren, Japanese sugar beet workers. So that's what's special about it. And eventually the industry raised the wage rate, but it was to prevent other strikes from happening. Right? So they denied union recognition, and that's the kicker here. The kicker is the growers will make appeasements in terms of elevating the wage rate, but they will not recognize the unions because that's giving away too much power. That's too much power to give to workers. So they're to mollify the workers. Okay, here's your raise that you want. Then the cycle happens again. They'll cut the wage rate in a couple of years all over again, or bring more immigrant workers to pit against domestic workers, quote unquote.
I think it's just such an interesting story. So flash forward, you talk about strikes and fights for fair wages, et cetera. I mean, one of the things you talk about in this book, and I can't remember what product it is. Is it strawberries, where the workers went in and what they were fighting for was to know what they would be paid per box before they started picking for the day? Because they didn't.
Yes.
Right? I got that right.
Yeah. Yes. That happened in strawberries. It also happened in citrus orchards. So workers went in to conduct picking assignments, not knowing what they were earning. So they're going to do work imagining that they're going to get this wage rate. And when they get their checks, right, it's much lower than they anticipated. So they started demanding upfront agreements. Okay, what is this orchard going to pay, right? And the ranch managers of Fillmore and Santa Paula, they would not concede that, because the growers would say, well, each orchard is different. each orchard has a different yield, and we have to determine that on a day by day basis. And the worker said, no, that's not right. We want to know in advance what we're being paid, at least by this time of the day, so we know what we're earning. And that became a major point of contention, and that led to several strikes in Fillmore and also Piru and Santa Paula.
I mean, and that was just one point of contention. So we're going to take questions pretty soon. Is it actually like 5:40? Is my watch right there? Yeah. Almost. But could you tell us about the Rancho, what you call the Rancho Cespi affair? Because that was another thing that led to this unrest.
Yes, well, Rancho Cespi is just outside of Santa Paula and Fillmore, kind of in between. And part of that history is personal, because my father grew up in Rancho Cespi. And my grandfather and his family were evicted from Rancho Cespi in the 1941 citrus strike, which was a county-wide strike. And they were evicted like many other families because they demanded an increase in the wage rate. And they were barely making it, surviving. And again, the reason for that is that the Growers Association wants to maximize profits. That's why immigrants do the work. You can pay them less. They have less worker protection, right? They have less recourse. Even more so if you're an undocumented worker. You can't complain too much if you don't have legal papers, right? So the agricultural industry knows that at least the vast majority, 60% of the workers are undocumented. That's no secret. That's no secret. But why does that happen? Because the industry benefits from that fact. Right? So in Rancho Cespi, there's a strike, but that memory doesn't go away. That strike mobilized, and there was that tradition of resistance, right, of struggle in these families that lived in Santa Paula, that lived in Fillmore, that lived in Rancho Cespi and Piru. And the children of these strikers in the 1940s were the children of the 1960s. They were the people of the 1960s. They saw their parents fight back, right? They saw their parents struggle and get mad and demand, right? So often the transgenerational part of the book is the students of the 60s just weren't, weren't just more brave. They had seen examples of this already, right? How to resist, how to organize, how to plan, how to work the system of politics, working with law enforcement or against law enforcement, negotiating with employers. This was learned through the Rancho Cespi evictions and also the Ventura County strike. And this was sort of the bugbear of the industry that carried. They feared, the industry feared another 1941 strike. That was going to be a county-wide strike. Right, so, and that's why I love what I do, because this is my family history, right? Many of the speakers that speak at the museum, they're talking about their families, right? I saw the last happy hour you had talking about her family, right? And I'm going to tell you about my family and how they are just as human as any other family. They want the best for their children. They want the best for their grandchildren, right? They want to have the nice things in life, right? Just as anybody else would have, right? And that comes from knowing one's history and one's background. So that's the Rancho Cespi affair to a large extent.
All right. Well, I have a lot more things I can talk to you about, but I would like to open it up to any of you, any stories you would like to hear, because he's got them all here in the room. And
So-
Denise, our deputy director, has a mic that she can carry over to you so we can all hear you.
Raise your hand and walk over, bring you the mic so you can ask a question. But there were some about available. So are there books available today, or will they be at the signing event in September? I should know the answer to
No,
that.
I don't have any other books other than my own copy, but there's a 50% discount at this moment at the University of Nebraska Press website. So if you go to the University of Nebraska Press website, a $60 book will cost you $30. Right, so I'm going to buy some more too myself, so I could give them my family, right, and friends. So University of Nebraska Press website, and there's a special code that's on the website, and you can get that.
And actually, if you signed up tonight, we'll send that code to you. We can do that as a follow-up here. And we're going to get some because we're having a book signing with all of the authors, or most of the authors that we have talked to in Local History Happy Hour, as well as some that we've talked to in Change Makers and other events. It's on a day, and it's in September. I think it's September 18th.
It is September 18th.
So yes, Doc, you'll be there. Yes,
I will be.
He's in. So if you buy one, bring it, and you can sign it, or we will have some for sale there.
Okay, thank you. I don't so much have a question, but I do want to comment on the way you wrote the book that I so much appreciate. Because when you're talking about the police and police problems with the communities, whether it's, say, Santa Paula, or whether it's Oxnard, or wherever it is in Ventura County, I really liked the way you would, for instance, get the information from the police report, and then you would get the information that either the Ventura Star Free Press or the Oxnard Press Courier, how they covered the report. And then the important part, you went to the families involved and got their information. I mean, that we don't always get that. And I really appreciated, that style of writing. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, but I wanted to say that. And I also want to say that I got 4 books.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And yes, for many of the stories involving the police department, particularly, but also in strikes, I try to get as many different sources as possible, so I could get a more well-rounded perspective and comment it as fairly as I could, right? One of the criticisms of modern day commercial newspapers, right, is that they often just get the press releases from law enforcement and publish it. You don't get the perspective of the people. You don't get the perspective of the community. You just get the perspective of law enforcement, right? And I know that because there's an Oxnard City Councilman that passes on the press releases from the Oxnard Police Department. And that's one side. But there are many sides. There's not just 2 sides. There are many sides to a story, but oftentimes the public only gets one side. So in my work, I try to write from a perspective of many different sources. So thank you. Thank you.
More questions?
Frank, I'm just curious, I did that documentary on the city of Oxnard, and Angela Suhu had mentioned that after her husband, Bill Suhu, came back from the war, he tried to move to the northern part of Oxnard. And she said there was this thing called the yellow dog clause, which means if you're Asian, you're not going to get a house. Was there something comparable to that, to the Mexican, the people?
Yes, thank you. In many of the deeds, and this is related to school segregation too, in the deeds, there were restrictive covenants. In the deeds, there was language there that property, certain property, Anglo-American property, neighborhoods, could not be sold to people of color. The labels of that time were Negroes, quote unquote, label for Asians Americans was Mongolians, right, and Mexicans, what have you, Indians too, and so that was written into the deeds of property, and so only certain people could move into those unless they were domestic servants. Unless they were domestic servants, they couldn't live there, right? Then there was sundown clauses too. The people of color, African Americans, Mexican Americans, and other people of color, Native people of this land could not be in, for example, North Oxnard after 5 o'clock. It was called sundown clauses. And if they were found in white neighborhoods, the police would arrest them or transport them, escort them out. So this is why schools were segregated, because people of color couldn't move into, let's say, Deodore Street in Oxnard, right? They couldn't move there. So you had Kern Elementary that was predominantly white students, right? And Colonia being predominantly Mexican students, because you had these forces, institutionalized forces of real estate, schools, law enforcement, and so forth and so on, economics. And so these institutions became part of a larger system of racism. And we're still living with that today. Churches too, yes. Definitely so.
We also have some questions coming in from our home audience. So I want to give everybody here a chance to ask your questions, and then I'll take it to the computer. Any other questions?
Yes, so the home audience, we should let you know that in person, coming to local history happy hour, you're welcome. We have a limited audience. It's free. We serve whatever beverage our author is having, but you have to be a member of the museum. So home audiences, think about that.
And it's so easy to do on their website. I was commenting that earlier. It was seamless and painless too.
You can do it right now.
Good evening, Frank. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the interaction with the Chicano community and law enforcement, specifically in some of those like legendary brawls you narrate in the book in Santa Paula and Oxnard. Because those are stories I just never heard of growing up, but I think especially nowadays are particularly relevant.
Yes, again, going back to change and continuity, right? In Oxnard, relations between the Oxnard Police Department and residents of La Colonia, particularly the youth, not good, right? And I knew that, and I read many of the newspaper articles in the Oxnard Press Courier, which is really a shame. Our local newspapers are no longer exist, right? So we don't get coverage or in-depth coverage like we used to. We had the Ventura County Star Free Press, right? Was much larger and covered different communities, than it does today in terms of the Ventura County Star. And there are market forces that cover that. There are reasons that explain that. But also in Santa Paula, I think it's the Santa Paula Chronicle, if I remember correctly, right? And so I came across the LA Times article about these literally uprisings taking place in Santa Paula. And so I said, well, let's see what Santa Paula newspapers say about this. And there was in-depth coverage about literally these pitched battles between Chicana and Chicano youth for about 3 Sundays straight. 3 Sundays straight. Just, I mean, you were talking weapons. We're talking cars, Chicano youth having weapons in their cars because they just had enough of the police brutality. I mean, think about it. What level of harassment has to take place where you're actually saying, well, I'm okay with, going toe to toe with the police. It has to be pretty bad, right? It wasn't because it had nothing to do. Well, maybe in Santa Paula, maybe. I'm kidding. But this took place where then the parents of the youth in Santa Paula had to step in. And I got this I got this idea from watching the series Chicano. It was the 1990s. It's a series that came out kind of like Eyes on the Prize for the African American experience. And when the students were being beaten by the LAPD of the student walkouts, the parents were faulting themselves. They were saying, why are we allowing this to happen to our kids? Right? And I think the same thing happened in Santa Paula. The parents said to themselves, our kids are being murdered out there and we're not doing anything about it. So you see the parents of Santa Paula and the older generation, the transgenerational part of it, they begin to be brokers. They step in and they hold accountable. I think it was one of his name was Mayor Teague. It wasn't Charles Collins Teague, but I think it was Charles M. Teague, who was the mayor of Santa Paula at the time. And they begin to say, okay, this has to stop, right? And the police department, like many police departments at that time, they say, we don't know where this is coming from. We don't understand why the students or these youth are upset. And it was only because students protested and there was some newspaper coverage on that we got a sense of why they were after the first melee, if you will. Young men and women protested in front of the Santa Paula police department and said, end police brutality, stop, beating us up, right? If it wasn't for that, it wouldn't have made the historical record, because the police department was always saying, we don't know what's, this is, and the Oxnard Police Department was saying the same thing. We don't know why they're throwing bottles at us and throwing rocks at us. The police chiefs had to order steel helmets, as the book details, right? We have to order steel helmets because we're getting pelted every time we go into La Colonia. Well, why were they being pelted? That was never testified to by the police, right? And it was only because the Brown Berets started speaking up at city council meetings and saying, we are monitoring the police. We are watching you. We are going to contest, your unlawfulness, right, and excessive use of force. And it made the historical record, so people like me can actually see and also I do a lot of oral history interviews. So that's what really gets me excited is interview. I had an interview today with a person from Santa Paula, and I was really that gets me excited about doing what I do. So I hope I answered your question.
One more here.
Any other questions from the live audience?
When you first started, you were talking about Moxie and the language, and I love your concept with self-esteem and from learning history stuff. But way back when, I don't know, I was going to a fantastic play in LA. I don't remember the name of it was Machismo, but it was about machismo, and it was about the split between Mexican and Chicano, Spanish and all that. But you never used that word, so does Moxie equate to machismo?
Not for me. Not for me, not at all, really. It's just sort of having a certain bravado, self-confidence, right? That's the way I use it. And the play sounds a lot similar. Maybe you're referring to Zoot Suit of the 1970s. Maybe Zoot Suit? Was it Zoot Suit that you saw? Okay.
Okay, we'll start to take some questions from the audience who are tuning in from home. And the first is from Adriana Castro. She wants to know, how and when did you realize that Chicano history was your calling or passion and that you wanted to pursue as a career?
It's a great question. Well, I'm the first generation college-going person in my family, right? So, and for many reasons, I was not college bound, but even though my parents wanted me to go to college and they reminded me you're going to college, and okay, I'll go to college. And my mom said to me one time in Spanish, you either go to college or you got to go get a job. And then, I said, well, that's a pretty simple choice. I'll go to college. So I went to Moorpark College out of high school. And I took a history class, and my idea was to survive, to not fail in college. So I got a B in history. And I said, well, I can do this, I'm going to major in history, right? Then I started learning my family's history. And I remember my grandfather and my grandma talking about the strikes of 1941. So it was over time, I felt I had to know more about my history, but also share it with others. And I'm at a kind of a juncture in my career, whether to do two things, go into administration in higher ed, continue teaching, or retire, right? That's where I'm at in my life. And I think I just want to write more books. I think that's what I want to do, right? I can make a little bit more money going to administration, but that's not what gets me up in the morning, right? What gets me up in the morning is telling a history that hasn't been told. I want to tell my community story. So that's a great question. That's what drives me. That's my calling now, is to, as much as I can, tell my community's history and to counter or at least complicate other stories that exist out there, right? Okay, this is your community story, but let me tell you my community story, right? And it may not align with yours, right? For example, in anticipation of this event, I get regularly the Farm Bureau magazine. It's a magazine of Ventura County agriculture. I don't recognize that experience. And my grandfather was a citrus picker, packing house worker, my grandmother too, right? And those stories are not in a line with the Agricultural Association stories. So I'm not to say that those stories are not true, but I want to complicate that story with my stories. So thank you, Adriana.
Denise, I think we have time for one more. Sorry.
That's okay. So this is from Laura Espinosa. She's asking Dr. Barajas, I am curious about the generational trauma from all of the experiences you describe. Is there research specific to this topic? Resilience is beautiful, but there must be a lingering negative impact.
That's as a historian, I don't know. I would assume that there is some PTSD out there that families intergenerationally experience, because let's take the issue of police violence. It's not just the person that experiences that, it's the whole family that experiences that, the young and old, right? So I would imagine that trauma is intergenerational, and it takes a long time to recover from. Definitely the community. I mean, this tension, Black Lives Matter, for example. This is not just a 2021-20 issue. This is something that goes back. We're talking about going back to the origins of the United States of America. That's what Jill Lepore, a Harvard historian, has argued. This goes back to colonialism in the United States of America. It goes back to slavery. Police departments have their origin in slavery. That's where the police department DNA comes from. We have to recognize that to get things better.
I know that I'm sure that there are a lot more questions, and all I can say is, based on this conversation, I think we should have you back again for our next season of Local History Happy Hour, because and apparently you'll have a lot more books that we can be talking.
Thank you, Elena.
Frank, I just want to thank you so much, and I'm so glad that there was a question about you. I think that the way that you use your personal history and the history of the people around you to illustrate and really provide a deeper understanding of these huge societal trends, the way you talk about how this opened the door to allow this to happen and this nudged this over here, kind of the ripple effects, it really enlightens. It really enlightened me about the larger history and about what's happened here in our county. So With that, I just really want to thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for writing this great book and the future books. And thank all of you for
I
joining
appreciate that.
us
I
for Local
appreciate it.
History Happy Hour.
Thank you, Elena.